The McCormick House was built in 1951-52 for Robert McCormick, who had come to know Mies because he was a silent partner in the construction of 860-880 Lakeshore Drive. His family owned the land on which that project was built. Mies van der Rohe was an architect in Germany before World War II and emigrated to the United States in 1937. All of Mies's work occupies a central, if not the central place in the evolution of the international style after World War II. The most famous Miesism is less is more. His work was simple, extremely balanced and elegant, very refined in detail. Mies van der Rohe probably would not accept that what he did was stylistic. For him, it was pure architecture. He was a very highly regarded, young, edgy, conceptual architect in Germany. He was really interested in what new technology, new ways of living, urbanism, the way that contemporary industrial and social life could be captured with contemporary architecture. He came from the Bauhaus, very highly regarded craft and design school in Germany. It wasn't just an architecture school. It dealt with architecture as part of a continuum that started with furniture and jewelry design, textiles, as well as painting and sculpture, graphic design. Many highly regarded people came out of the Bauhaus or were faculty there. Many of them came to the United States and to a degree, reestablished very similar sorts of programs here at IIT. Of course, there wasn't much work. He got here. It was still the Depression here in the United States. But the war effort finally blew the economy out of the Depression and created huge industries mobilized to meet the war requirements in steel, in aluminum, manufacturing, automobiles, airplanes. So after the war is over, you've got all this mobilized industry and nothing to do with it. So many aspects of conventional life were now being addressed with reinvention from this war industry. You started seeing steel kitchen cabinets. St. Charles kitchens were very popular. 50s were an interesting time in the United States. As the dust settled after World War II, there was a lot of catching up to do. There was this sort of undertone of excitement and possibility. One of the major trends happening after the war was the explosive growth in the suburbs. People were coming back, they were having families. Suddenly there's a population boom, coupled with the new mobility of automobiles being even more economical and available, another byproduct of the ramped up war effort, retooled to meet domestic need, led to a huge amount of social mobility. There's perhaps apocryphal story of McCormick and Mies standing on Lakeshore Drive during the construction of 860-880, watching it being built, and sort of radical exploration of steel and glass.
We were standing on Lakeshore Drive one day back in about 1949 or 50, and looking at the building, at the 860 building, which was being erected on the Lakeshore Drive. The steel was coming in from the manufacturers and was being hoisted into place. As we looked at it, Mies said, "Why must we do it like this? Why can't we do it like this?" I said, I need a house. Why don't we? And this is the house that developed from that conversation.
That was the genesis of this house. It was a trial to see if that kind of construction would lend itself to designing a typical tract house, a subdivision that McCormick was planning to build in the western suburbs. Americans coming home from the war were moving out to the suburbs, moving to Levittown.
And it was his hope to have an impact on this type of construction, this single-family construction. So we took a trip down to Long Island where they were building thousands of buildings on this. We used to be potato farms and selling them on weekends by the thousands and building them to keep up with sales. They literally were building towns in months, and major towns. We didn't take into consideration that this sort of design was ahead of the times, and people didn't want to live in a building like this.
Needless to say, it was the only one that was built. The McCormick House is one of only 3 houses that Neath actually built in the United States. The Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, outside the city, and the 3rd one in Connecticut. Well, the McCormick House embodies a lot of the issues and tropes of the 50s in terms of construction technology, and also the way people live. It's a horizontal house. It's oriented to the outside. It's sort of, if you will, an international style version of a ranch house that was also becoming very popular and very common in post-war construction development. The ranch house being a sort of watered down impression of a Frank Lloyd Wright house, the sort of ground-hugging horizontal house with great views of the outside. Well, so the McCormick House does all of that, but from the standpoint of a very, let's say, Teutonic steel and glass armature instead of wood frame. The house was built on a large suburban lot and landscaped by Alfred Caldwell, who was a frequent collaborator with Mies van der Rohe. And when we found the house in the early 90s, that landscape was still intact, but so overgrown that you couldn't see the house from the street. But that's really the perfect environment to build a glass house. So, you know, your privacy comes from the landscape and not from the sort of layering of the building and its materials. The glass and the transparency really gave you a kind of virtual space that was much larger than the actual footprint of the house. As a suburban house, as a family house, it was at least conceptually thought of as being flexible. All the interior partitions were constructed like solid core doors on cleats, top and bottom, so that they could be easily disassembled and reconfigured. It had a St. Charles steel kitchen, I mentioned that before. It had aluminum windows, which were detail for detail identical to the windows at 860, 880 Lakeshore Drive. In fact, the steel frame was down to the I section, the W section mullion turned outwards was identical to 860, 880 Lakeshore Drive. What's really interesting about this house, looking back on it today, is the degree to which it shows how Mies was wrestling with all these technical issues, how to build aluminum and glass windows. By contemporary standards, very crudely, but at the time, very, interesting explorations in how to do these very, very simple sight lines, lots of glass, very minimal structure. Well, ultimately, McCormick moved into it. I believe he used it as a summer house and then lived in it for about 9 years. After he left the house, it was rented and finally sold to a family, the Ficks, who lived in the house for 29 years until the early 90s. So the house only had 2 owners prior to the Elmhurst Art Museum. The Ficks raised a family in the house and lived there for a considerable amount of time, did a lot of interior restoration and reconstruction work. So A lot of the interiors we found were not original when we took over the house. Moving the house was an adventure. The house was about half a mile from its present location. That's about how far we had to move it. And the house was 2 rectangles. So with all the pieces we removed, reconditioned, restored, that left us with these 2 steel cages. Each one weighed about 4 or 5 tons. And we turned them into trailers, you know, and had a pickup truck tow them one at a time. We actually had a little parade, and people sold balloons and popcorn and things like that, and we sold tickets to it as a fundraiser. Maybe our first fundraiser for the museum was the move. Eleanor King Hookham was the director of the Elmhurst Fine Arts and Civic Center Foundation, which was the precursor organization of the museum, the Elmhurst Art Museum. The institution existed and predated the museum, but it was always her dream to build a proper museum in downtown Elmhurst.
And I am pleased to introduce to you that expression of love, that community spirit of Elmhurst, that representative of bringing our community together, Eleanor Hookham.
I'm terribly proud of this beautiful building, and the job of getting it built belongs to all of us.
We unearthed, in our preliminary research, we unearthed a magazine article authored by Mies van der Rohe from the 40s on the design of, it was a conceptual project, the design of a museum for a small city, in which he describes how a small city museum is not like a large international kind of exhibition palace. He describes it as being designed for the enjoyment, not the internment of art. What we really bent over backwards to do was to break down the design of the museum itself to a series of smaller pavilions that would not overwhelm the house, and then the house be just one more of this village of simple pavilions around a courtyard. So that was the essential idea behind both designing the building and also incorporating the house into it. The McCormick House is important because it was part of Mies's process. What's really compelling about this house is the degree to which it illustrates a moment in time in which all of these new technologies were being employed in a very simple suburban house. So that was very interesting, and this house is a snapshot of the beginning of the process of understanding how to do mass-produced aluminum windows. By contemporary standards, they're very crude. The idea of the movable partitions, the steel framing, all these things were very formative ideas. If you look at 860, 880 Lakeshore Drive as the beginning of that exploration, and the details in the house are really basically the same details. It's the same window, it's the same mullion in the steel frame. It's the beginning of an exploration that ends with the windows behind me that we're sitting in the building we're sitting in right now, the IBM building. It's both a piece of architectural history and an accessible piece of Mies's design. Of course, you know, every architectural tourist who comes to Chicago goes to see 860, 880, but that first window is 30 feet up in the air. So this is the opportunity to touch it, see how it's made in a way that's not available to you in downtown Chicago.